I think my personal experience of going through that, first the stress, which is so incredibly overwhelming. And I found myself in a position where I was really needing to find support to ground me through that process, but not just for me, but for the sake of my girls. And in looking back, I think that I conceded to things quickly just for the sake of getting on the other side of it that I regretted later on.
Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Katherine Miller. This is where we have honest, thoughtful conversations about divorce, the emotional, financial, legal, and family questions no one prepares you for. From deciding whether to separate, to navigating the process with dignity, to rebuilding what comes next, Divorce Dialogues is here to help you find clarity, perspective, and a better way forward. What I see over and over again in divorce is that people think that the hardest part is going to be the legal process, but it's not. It's actually the money and the feelings. And very often it's the feelings about the money that drive everything else. Because money in divorce isn't just about spreadsheets or budgets. It's about identity. It's about security. It's about control. And very often it's about fear. And when those feelings get activated, they start to shape the financial decisions people make, sometimes in ways they don't even fully see. People either avoid the financial conversation altogether, or they become extremely rigid about it, and neither of those paths leads to a good outcome. So what this conversation is really about is how to approach money in a different way, one that allows you to understand your financial reality and stay grounded enough to make thoughtful decisions. Today, I'm speaking with Kimberley Threadgill, a certified financial planner and a certified divorce financial analyst who helps individuals navigate the financial complexities of divorce. Kimberley has spent her career advising high net worth and ultra high net worth clients at firms like JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley, and she brings both deep technical expertise and a thoughtful human approach to financial decision making. In this conversation, we go beyond the numbers to talk about what money actually represents during divorce, a lot of those emotions, fear, identity, control, and uncertainty, and how understanding your financial picture can help you move forward with greater clarity and confidence. This is really about making informed decisions in a moment that can feel anything but clear. Kimberley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Katherine. It's my pleasure to be here.
I know that you've worked with high net worth individuals for a long time. And how do you see divorce disrupting someone's sense of financial identity and not just their balance sheet? Because I think a lot of people who are not high net worth or very high net worth think, well, what do those people have to worry about?
Well, sure. But I think more often than not, there's the fear of the unknown. Most are just unclear of what the next chapter holds. And when you are married and you're jointly presented to in your community in various ways, not knowing what that change is going to bring, that becomes a big point of stress for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think the big unknown is a lot of anxiety about things, both that they're actually worried about, like, can I stay living here? Am I going to be able to maintain this lifestyle? But also not knowing what they don't know and the fear of that. Do you find that to be true?
Of course. I think, when you go from a certain income, establishing and supporting one joint lifestyle and having to make that change into separating into two, there's a lot of change that has to occur. That a change is not comfortable for a lot of people.
What are some of those misconceptions you think that people have as they come into the divorce process? They make an assumption about divorce or what it means, and those turn out not actually to be true.
It certainly depends on what state you're in, but a lot of people may expect things are going to be distributed 50-50, and there's a real difference between community property estate and a state where there's equitable distribution, right? And there's a lot of factors that come into play when a judge is considering equitable distribution. So yeah, I think it's important to understand, the state that you're in, have an understanding of what those factors are, and being open to making changes according to what realistic expectations should be. That's super important.
Yeah. So just for the listeners, just a little simple explanation of what Kim just said there. That is that some states are what we call, quote, community property states. And those states generally have, it's not 100% true, but generally have 50-50 distribution of assets that are determined to be marital. And the other states are what's called equitable distribution states. And in New York, which is an equitable distribution state, we have about 1 million cases that say equitable does not mean equal, but it often does. But a court has to consider a number of factors, including the length of the marriage and how the money came to the marriage and all sorts of other things, and then make a determination as to what is equitable, although that doesn't necessarily mean equal. So, Kimberly, do you have any disagreement with what I just said or further nuance you want to put on it?
No, I'm in New York and I understand that to be exactly the situation. Yeah, so you're exactly right.
When we were sort of getting ready to start the show, you were telling me a little bit about what brought you to doing this work and your experience that's personal. And one of the reasons that I do this show and the firm that I created is because of my own personal experience of divorce. And so if you'd be willing maybe to share with our listeners a little bit about that, I think that would be really helpful.
I have, full disclosure, I've been now divorced for about 16 years. So I was a single mom on the other side of that, raising 2 girls. And, I graduated magna cum laude, the degree in finance, years before being divorced, and thought I had a real grasp on things more than I really did. I think my personal experience of going through that, first the stress, which is so incredibly overwhelming. And I found myself in a position where I was really needing to find support, through that, to ground me through that process, but not just for me, but for the sake of my girls. And in looking back, I think that I conceded to things quickly just for the sake of getting on the other side of it that I regretted later on. And so through that experience and years after being divorced, I decided to go into being a holistic advisor for clients in the space of finance in order to help people, right? And to hopefully educate people, male or female, to understand investments and finances and have a comfort level in that, to people to ask the questions and be educated and have a sense of ownership of that for their own sense of security and to not go through what I went through so many years before. So that's why you find me today with a CFP and a CDFA. Both of those were very intentional on this path of really trying to help other people have a better experience and a more secure future.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I think it would be really helpful for people for the listeners who might be in that place of, listen, I just want this over. Like, I don't care what the outcome is. I just want it over because this is painful. It's super expensive. I want to get my life back on track. I have a lot of compassion for that perspective. Wanting to get it over it is very stressful and expensive to be going through it. I'm curious about sort of the intersection of your own personal experience along with what you've learned having gotten the CFP and the CDFA designation as to how you would talk to someone in that who might be finding herself or himself in that place right now.
I think slow down. It's not that I certainly wouldn't want to be an advocate for elongating the process. Let's not say that. But I think to slow down and gain a sense of self. Remember that somewhere along the way, whether you have lost that sense of self or maybe you have never had that, it's so important to find who you are. And even if you're on the journey and you're not quite there, being able to slow down and know that, especially if you have children, you want to not move so quickly or in a sense of emotion where you're thinking about the wrong or that's done or whatever was going on in the past. All of that is so difficult. It's easy to say, and I understand that, but it's so important that you set it aside and you start to think about what's going on today is not going to be forever. And where do I see myself? What would look like a peaceful place in the future? And in order to get there, rushing through or making quick decisions without educating yourself, without slowing down and asking questions. And if you're not getting answers, find a way to get those answers, right? You want to have good counsel. Counsel is very expensive, but you can also self-educate and ask the right questions and take the time to be still, but then make your decisions out of a sense of balance. And that's super, super important. Very hard to do. And I know what I'm saying is easy to say, but I have been there and wish that I had done it that way.
I think it's really interesting because it's the future that you don't necessarily know, right? So it's easy to say, $5, $10, fine. I'll take 5 instead of 10 or pay 10 instead of 5. And that kind of decision could be fine sort of in the short term. But it's the longer term things, the what ifs, things like a cost of living adjustment or a change in circumstances that might happen down the road. If there's a cash flow plan that lasts a while, like if you have young children or there's a long-term alimony or something like that. So for you, you're a financial planner and you're also a certified divorce financial analyst. How do those two different professions approach the divorce process, and how can somebody know what they might need as they're trying to make the right decision?
Having a CFP is something that I have because I have always holistically advised clients. From day one, I actually didn't even apply to work with a firm until I had already applied to University of Georgia. And I was several months into the process of getting my CFP because I wanted to be doing more than just advising on investments alone. I think there is an integral connectivity between choosing investments and understanding that the right investments also, it's imperative that you understand the tax nature of those things. So tax planning is very important, right? So is estate planning and just titling things, especially if you're single, right? Or even you get to the point where you're remarried, but now you have your own children. Estate planning is super important. And so those were the foundational things I did first. Now, when I advise clients and currently I'm with a wonderful firm, Stansberry Asset Management, I manage about $300 million for clients across the East Coast. And so I holistically advise those clients. When a divorce situation comes up, or I'm with a client who's already divorced coming to me, I can advise them from this seat. I cannot be serving them as a CDFA. That's a conflict of interest to be involved in the divorce process. And so I would have to refer them out to somebody else who has a CDFA. Having that accreditation has enabled me to understand in terms of where the assets are. And when you're talking about splitting and different things like that, it's understanding that this is a client who would benefit from talking through a little bit on that. But as far as advising from the divorce perspective, I'm always saying, speak with your counsel.
Divorce Dialogues is brought to you by Miller Law Group. We believe divorce isn't just a legal process, it's a human transition. At Miller Law Group, we help people navigate divorce with dignity, clarity, and respect, focusing on conversations that lead to better outcomes for families. Learn more at miller-law.com. So, at the beginning of the show, I talked a lot about the role of emotions, fear, guilt, avoidance. And I'm wondering, in your experience of working with divorcing people, how you see that happening. And I'm also wondering if you think that there were some emotions that drove your own personal rush to get it over with. Listen, I also rushed to get it over with when I got divorced. And I got divorced more like 27 years ago. I can see back now the things that I thought were important turned out to not be unimportant, but not as important as other things that I didn't necessarily realize. And I don't think it's possible, Ken, to really know what the future holds. My crystal ball is in the shop, and it has been for some time. I just can't seem to get it working. I think there are some areas where we as professionals, and you as a financial professional, can help someone really focus on how they should be thinking about something, not decide for them, but how they should be thinking about something. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, gosh, I mean, it's such a challenge being on a podcast. There could be anybody listening and a variety of different people who have different values of what they really want and appreciate. But I know my biggest concern was the house, the home, and having younger children at the time, trying to create the least disruption with their schooling and with the home, just anything that would just keep things stable for a while. And looking back on that, what you realize, certainly from a financial slant, is, properties, especially owning properties, can be a real draw from your assets, just to maintain. And looking back on that, I just think that was the least important thing. I would not have put so much emphasis on that as I would on assets that, certainly looking back from that time, which would have been 2009, 2010 to today, if you think about what equities have done, exponentially grown in that period of time versus what the value of the home would have done. It's very different. A lot of things I would have considered and done differently. I don't know if I answered your question fully, though.
No, you definitely answered part of it. I think there was an ad on the Metro North trains for a while there, maybe 10 years ago, that said something like, your house is worth $1 million is not a retirement plan. And, that sort of comes to mind as to what you're saying. And a lot of people want to hold on to the home for just the reasons you did, right? And I think that it is true that that's not always a wise decision, although it might be long-term, not a wise decision. Short-term, it might be good from stability for yourself, stability for your children, a sense of that your life hasn't just been blown totally out of the water, and more importantly, your kids. And at the same time, thinking about that in a holistic approach makes a lot of sense. But I'm also asking about the feelings, like feelings of anger or guilt or shame. How do you think that impacts? I think that impacts a lot of money decisions all the time, not just in divorce. It's just that those feelings during divorce are really heightened. So what is your experience? Not necessarily personally, but professionally.
I know that there's a life where it's been identified a certain way, and seeing that change, or not knowing how you can change. I think a lot of people have to kind of evaluate what they want. And for a lot of folks, they have to decide how they're going to work. If they weren't working before, what does that look like? Listen, I do want to bring up my personal experience in this way, because I hope that it speaks to at least one person out there. At that time, I was running my own business, and it had only been around for maybe 2 or 3 years at the time. It was very new. And I continued to run that because it allowed me to have the flexibility to take my kids to school, to pick them up, and to work around that. But there's a point where I realized that this is not what I want to do long term. I have this degree in finance, and it was really put on my heart to go in this direction. So when I did this, I was in my early 40s. It's not exactly the easiest area to go into, let's be honest. I mean, I worked alongside guys that inherited their book from their dad and received new clients from golfing. But I really had to start from ground zero in this space. But I was very much driven because of wanting to know what I didn't know. I figured if I didn't know this, probably a lot of other people don't know all of these things about investing, and especially women don't seem to be very involved. I see that a lot in my practice, where it's a matter of choice for a lot. What I try to prevent is for especially women, but men too, to be in life-changing moments like divorce or the death of a spouse. And that's when you start to dial in on the finances and understanding your wealth and how it grows, and all of that. It's so very important.
So, Kim, in your experience, what separates someone who does take hold of the numbers and comes out of the divorce financially stable from someone who doesn't?
Looking ahead. Someone who looks ahead. Someone who focuses not behind them, but ahead. And I think it's difficult. I think if there's a lot of wrongs and hurt and pain, that's very difficult to do. That sort of thing just rent free in your head for years just doesn't serve you. And as soon as folks realize that, and some people do sooner than others, then they start to focus more on what life can be. And that's looking ahead and saying, here's where we are. And the future can be a lot of different things. And a lot of that is at our own kind of lands with us. What are we going to do with where we are today? Right. And I think a lot of people do realize that, but I hope, for those that win, if you will, in that space, winning is really not about who ends up with more toys or more stuff. It's who ends up, genuinely fulfilled and in that next chapter. And that can come from a lot of different things.
Yeah. Divorce sits at the intersection between what was and what will be. And if you spend all of your time looking at what was or wasn't, instead of what will be, you lose the opportunity to shape that, to form it. And you will, whether or not you reach a resolution, which 95% of people nationwide do on your own and sign a contract, then you sign it backwards looking instead of forwards looking, or you rely on a judge who is doing what a judge does based on the instructions the law gives that person in terms of making the decisions. If you're not forming the future that you want, it's going to be pretty hard to get there. I think that's what you're saying.
100%.
So for people, and I think this is often women, even in this modern day, who may not have been less involved in the finances and may feel overwhelmed. Sometimes people are like, oh, I'm bad with numbers. I can't do that. How do they help start beginning to gain knowledge and confidence so that they can form a future plan for themselves?
By working with someone that gives them that space to feel comfortable in asking questions. And there's a variety of clients that I have that just want to know a certain amount, but they want to trust the person. They don't really need to know what a yield curve is and to go into a great in-depth understanding of investments. But, I do hold my clients accountable and say, listen, you don't need to trust me so much that you don't ask questions. I think it's important that you meet, especially early on, if you've not been focusing on your finances, that you meet early more often. Quarterly, if you're taking on the reins for the first time with your advisor and you're talking through things. And that advisor needs to be proactive and sharing things, telling you, what's your performance? Why are you in what you're in? Asking those questions of why are you invested in what you're in? There could be a lot of assumptions made, especially for clients that are working with the same advisor that he or she was with when they were married. There are a lot of assumptions in that. And from a CFP perspective, you know that a divorce is a material change in life. But those assumptions should be set aside. Now it's a new conversation. What is your future going to look like? What does your cash flow needs look like? What's your risk tolerance? No longer blended. It's what's yours. And, all of those things have to be readdressed in order to have a successful relationship. So it helps to have an advisor that gives you that ability to feel welcome in doing that there are no stupid questions or things that you're supposed to already know.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that I think that it can be very tempting to keep working with the same financial advisor that you had before. And it might be the right thing to do. The tendency might be, though, for that person not to realize that the plan has changed. So if the purpose of the plan was to do one thing while you were married, and now your portfolio is also your paycheck and it needs to be something else, or it needs to supplement you in ways it didn't before, then that's something you need to be able to have a really frank conversation with those people about. And you should ask yourself, is this a relationship that I'm comfortable with, even given that my soon-to-be ex or my ex is also in this relationship? And I am not advising people to change, just to consider that. And I think you agree with that. Is that right, Kim?
Yes. I think if your advisor's not asking that and saying, let's have a meeting because we need to discuss this, it's challenging for me to think of a situation post-divorce where that joint portfolio should look exactly the same on the other side. I think that's difficult for me to to see or expect that that would be the case. More often than not, it would be the reverse, in my opinion. And so readdressing that is it's really important. So if your advisor is not proactively bringing that up, then please bring that up and ask the questions. And keep in mind that if you were setting back and your former spouse was the person doing most of the communication, that this is a time where you no longer have the luxury of sitting back. Now there's a certain baseline that you need to achieve in knowledge to understand. And so that this team will work for you and your best interests moving forward.
So, Kim, when you think about the clients that you've worked with, what do you think is one shift in thinking around money that tends to basically change everything for them during divorce?
I think a lot of folks have taken a lot of things for granted because they've had a certain relationship jointly with money, whether in some security based on maybe it's dual incomes, or dual incomes make things a lot easier than single. Not to mention the taxes are a little friendlier more often than not. I think having that change, it can be a little surprising for people, right? It's the same thing with surviving spouses when they go from married filing jointly to single. A lot of things change. Typically, there's a Social Security situation that's changing, right? A lot of that. So a lot of new things to learn about. And I find that, again, working with somebody that can highlight these things. I've never seen anybody shoot the messenger, but giving you a look ahead that you aren't surprised. It's always helpful because you'd like to know it before it happens and plan accordingly.
All right. So one last question in our last minute or so. If someone is listening right now, going through a divorce and feels totally uncertain about their financial future, what is one thing you'd want them to know right now?
Well, honestly, look, if I could in my 40s turn around and do what I've done, right, and start in this path and be at a point now where I'm managing $300 million for ultra high net worth clients across the East Coast, that wasn't even a thought in my mind at the time when I was going through a divorce. I think that it's important to know that you've heard this, I'm sure a lot of us have, that growth comes from pain and challenges. And the person that I am is someone I like a lot more than prior that experience. So try not to see this as the worst thing. You never know what can come from that. And of course, we're all capable of choosing that direction and making the most and maybe having a bigger life by recognizing that change can create some pretty amazing things in the future.
I think it's really, really great advice. Kim Threadgill, thank you so much for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Katherine.
If this conversation was helpful, share it with someone who might need it. And if you're navigating divorce yourself, you'll find more resources and episodes at miller-law.com. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.